The Martin B-26 Marauder entered United States Army Air Forces service in February 1941 with performance specifications that exceeded every medium bomber then operational. Maximum speed of 315 miles per hour, faster than many contemporary fighters. Ceiling of 25,000 feet. Bomb load of 4,000 pounds with range sufficient for strategic missions. The design had been ordered directly from the drawing board into production, bypassing the prototype competition phase that typically preceded large contracts. Martin's engineers had delivered an aircraft optimized for speed and altitude performance, qualities the Air Corps considered essential for survival over defended targets. By mid-1942, and training bases in the United States were reporting accident rates so severe that instructor pilots were refusing to accept new students until the aircraft was modified or replaced. The B-26 had earned a reputation among crews before it ever reached combat. That reputation was not based on enemy action. It was based on the aircraft's behavior during takeoff, landing, and any maneuver that occurred near the edge of its flight envelope. The specifications had promised invulnerability through speed. The reality delivered an aircraft that killed more crews in training than some types lost in combat. The Air Corps issued a requirement in 1939 for a high-speed medium bomber capable of operating at altitudes and speeds that would reduce exposure to anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. Martin's design team prioritized aerodynamic efficiency and power loading. The result was a compact, streamlined airframe powered by two Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines, each producing one 850 horsepower. Wing area was minimized to reduce drag, resulting in a wing loading of 53 pounds per square foot, the highest of any American aircraft then in service. This gave the B-26 its speed, but it also gave it a stall speed of 130 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour faster than the B-25 Mitchell, its direct competitor. The landing approach speed was correspondingly high, leaving minimal margin for error. Tricycle landing gear improved ground handling and visibility, but the narrow track made crosswind landings difficult. The aircraft's design philosophy was clear: optimize for cruise performance and accept higher demands on pilot skill. In the hands of experienced crews operating from long, prepared runways, this was manageable. In the hands of newly trained pilots at crowded training bases, it would prove lethal. Army Air Forces officials reviewed the design and accepted the trade-offs. Test flights at Wright Field demonstrated that the aircraft met its performance targets. Maximum speed exceeded projections. Range was adequate. The bomb bay accommodated the required payload. Martin received a production order for Fun 131 aircraft in September 1940 without a formal competitive evaluation. The urgency of rearmament outweighed procedural caution. The Air Corps believed it had procured a bomber that would dominate the European theater through sheer speed and operational ceiling. By 1942, training bases at MacDill Field in Florida, Barksdale Field in Louisiana, and others across the southern United States were operating under pressures that exposed every limitation in the B-26 design. Pilot training programs were accelerated to meet wartime demand. Crews transitioned to the B-26 after logging minimal hours in multi-engine aircraft. The training syllabus allocated insufficient time for pilots to develop proficiency in an aircraft that required precision during every phase of flight. Runways at some bases were shorter than optimal, a legacy of peacetime construction standards that had not anticipated high-performance bombers. Weather over the Gulf Coast included sudden thunderstorms, turbulence, and crosswinds that challenged even experienced pilots. Sorties were scheduled at high tempo to maximize training throughput, reducing maintenance time and increasing the likelihood that aircraft would be flown with minor unresolved defects. Instructor pilots were themselves learning the aircraft, as many had transitioned from lighter types only months earlier. These conditions, abbreviated training, marginal runways, variable weather, and inexperienced crews, were not present during the controlled test flights at Wright Field. The testing had validated the aircraft's performance. It had not validated whether the training infrastructure could safely produce crews capable of operating it. The first fatal accidents occurred during initial training flights in early 1941. An aircraft stalled on final approach at MacDill and crashed short of the runway, killing all aboard. Another failed to gain altitude after takeoff, struck trees at the departure end, and burned. A third experienced an engine failure immediately after liftoff, rolled inverted during the attempted single-engine climb, and impacted the ground. Within 6 months, accident rates at B-26 training bases exceeded 15 per 100,000 flight hours, nearly triple the rate for the B-25. Pilots began referring to the aircraft by names that reflected their assessment of its characteristics. Widowmaker became common usage, though not in official communications. Instructor pilots reported that students who successfully completed training on other types were unable to manage the B-26 takeoff and landing speeds. Several instructors submitted requests to transfer to other aircraft types or duties, citing concerns that they were sending inadequately prepared pilots into aircraft that would kill them. These were not expressions of fear. They were professional judgments based on observed outcomes. The accident pattern was consistent and mechanistically explicable, rooted in the wing loading and power to weight characteristics that gave the aircraft its performance. The high wing loading meant the B-26 required high speed to generate sufficient lift. During takeoff, the aircraft had to accelerate to approximately 120 miles per hour before the pilot could rotate. This required nearly all available runway length at many training bases. If an engine failed during the takeoff roll before reaching decision speed, stopping was impossible. If it failed after rotation but before the aircraft reached safe single-engine climb speed, the pilot faced an immediate choice: attempt to continue the climb on one engine and risk stalling, or lower the nose to maintain airspeed and impact terrain. Both options had killed crews. The aircraft's single-engine performance at maximum gross weight was marginal. Climb rate on one engine was less than 200 feet per minute under ideal conditions. Any deviation from precise control inputs, excessive bank, insufficient airspeed, delayed feathering of the dead engine's propeller, resulted in loss of altitude. Pilots trained to instinctively add power and pull back during emergencies found those inputs fatal in the B-26. The correct response: lower the nose, accept temporary altitude loss, maintain airspeed, was counterintuitive when the ground was visible and approaching. Several accidents involved pilots who intellectually understood the correct procedure but could not execute it under stress. The second failure mode involved landing. The high approach speed left little time to correct for deviations in glide path or alignment. Crosswinds required immediate correction, but the narrow landing gear track reduced directional stability on the ground. Pilots who landed with drift or who allowed the aircraft to drift after touchdown experienced ground loops that collapsed the landing gear and often resulted in fire. The B-26 fuel tanks were not self-sealing in early variants, and ruptured tanks ignited readily. Crews who survived the initial impact often died in the subsequent fire before rescue equipment arrived. The third issue was stall characteristics. The thin, high-speed wing stalled abruptly with little aerodynamic warning. In most aircraft, buffeting or control mushiness provided seconds of warning before full stall. The B-26 gave almost none. One moment the aircraft was flying, the next it was falling. Recovery required immediate recognition and nose-down input, but the stall often occurred during turns where the instinctive response was to pull back to tighten the turn or arrest the descent. This instinct killed pilots. The aircraft did not forgive errors. It provided no buffer between incorrect input and catastrophic outcome. The fourth contributor was psychological. Pilots who had witnessed accidents or who had experienced near stalls or single-engine emergencies approached subsequent flights with heightened anxiety. This anxiety degraded performance. Tense pilots over-controlled, inducing pilot-induced oscillations during approach. They hesitated during emergencies, delaying critical actions. They avoided maneuvering near stall speed, which limited their ability to develop proficiency in slow flight and emergency procedures. The aircraft's reputation became self-reinforcing. Accidents increased fear, which increased tension, which degraded performance, which caused more accidents. Training command officials faced a situation without clear precedent. Accident rates were statistically undeniable, but production was accelerating and combat units needed crews. Suspending training would delay deployment. Replacing the aircraft would require years and would waste the substantial investment already made. The response was incremental modification and procedural adjustment. Wingspan was increased by 6 feet in later production models, reducing wing loading and lowering stall speed by approximately 10 miles per hour. This helped, but it did not eliminate the underlying difficulty. Minimum pilot experience requirements were raised. A training syllabi were extended. Emergency procedures were revised to emphasize single-engine handling and stall recognition. These measures reduced accident rates but did not eliminate pilot reluctance. By late 1942, some newly trained pilots were requesting assignment to other bomber types, a request that was officially discouraged but informally accommodated when possible. Instructor pilots continued to submit reports describing the aircraft as unsuitable for the abbreviated training pipeline it was being operated in. These reports were acknowledged but not acted upon in any systemic way. The war required crews. The B-26 was in production. Training would continue. Combat deployment began in 1942, initially in the Mediterranean and later in Europe. Operational squadrons, staffed by crews who had survived training and gained experience, achieved acceptable loss rates and mission effectiveness. The B-26 proved capable of the missions it was designed for when flown by proficient crews from adequate air bases. Its speed did provide some protection against interception. The structural strength allowed it to absorb battle damage. Over time, the aircraft's combat record improved its reputation among crews who flew it operationally, but the training experience remained a persistent issue. Between 1941 and 1943, the B-26 training program experienced over 500 fatal accidents in the United States, killing more than 400 crew members. These were not combat losses. They were training attrition, directly attributable to the mismatch between the aircraft's demands and the training infrastructure's ability to safely produce qualified crews. By 1944, improvements in training, modifications to the aircraft, and increased instructor experience had reduced accident rates to acceptable levels, but the initial period remained a defining characteristic of the type's history. The B-26 had been designed for performance. It had achieved that performance at the cost of handling qualities that required skill levels the training system could not reliably produce within the time available. The specifications had prioritized speed and altitude. They had not accounted for the pilot workload and precision required to operate an aircraft with minimal margins. Testing had confirmed the design met its targets. It had not confirmed that the typical pilot could safely fly it. The gap between engineering achievement and operational reality had been filled with the deaths of crews who were asked to master an aircraft that offered no forgiveness for the inexperience they inevitably brought to it. By war's end, the B-26 had compiled a credible combat record. It had also compiled a training record that no amount of later success could erase. Pilots who refused to fly it were not cowards. They were realists who understood that the aircraft's capabilities came with demands they were not certain they could meet. And that uncertainty, in an aircraft with no margin for error, was indistinguishable from a death sentence.